Before we start, hit that subscribe to support the channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. What I'm about to share with you will fundamentally challenge everything you believe about reality, about faith, and about humanity's place in the universe. My name is Dr. Elena Rodriguez, and for 12 years I served as a xenobiology specialist at a classified government facility that officially doesn't exist. I held clearances above top secret and witnessed things that would shatter the worldview of every person on this planet. 3 months ago, I was diagnosed with an aggressive brain tumor. The doctors give me 6 months, maybe 8 with treatment. I have chosen to forego the treatment because there's something more important than extending my life. There's a truth that humanity deserves to know before I take it to my grave. For over a decade, I've carried knowledge that could change the course of human civilization, knowledge about extraterrestrial beings and their understanding of what we call biblical truth. You need to understand something right now. I'm not some conspiracy theorist looking for attention. I'm not someone who sees hidden meanings in every shadow. I'm a scientist with advanced degrees from MIT and Stanford who dedicated her career to understanding biological systems beyond Earth's origin. I followed protocols, maintained security clearances, and kept quiet when ordered to do so. But sitting here in my apartment in Denver, knowing my time is limited, I've decided some truths are too important to die with. The facility where I worked contained 17 extraterrestrial beings from 7 different species. These weren't crashed pilots or accidental visitors. These were entities who had been in contact with human governments for decades, sharing information that our leaders deemed too dangerous for public knowledge. What they revealed about the nature of reality, about the true history recorded in biblical texts, and about humanity's spiritual destiny would cause mass psychological upheaval if released without preparation. For years, I watched these beings interact with our top theologians, physicists, and government officials. I witnessed conversations that redefined everything we thought we knew about creation, about divine intervention, and about the cosmic significance of human consciousness. The entities I worked with possessed knowledge spanning millions of years, perspectives on existence that made our greatest philosophical achievements seem like children's drawings. One being in particular, designated as Entity Designation 7, became my primary research subject. This entity stood roughly 8 feet tall with elongated limbs and skin that seemed to absorb and reflect light simultaneously. Its eyes held depths of intelligence that made direct contact overwhelming. But what separated this being from the others wasn't its physical characteristics. It was its intimate knowledge of what we call scripture, its detailed understanding of events recorded in biblical texts, and its shocking revelations about the true nature of these accounts. During my first interview session with Entity Designation 7, it communicated through direct consciousness transfer. Human language was too limited for the concepts it needed to convey. The sensation was like having thoughts placed directly into my mind, complete with emotional context and layers of meaning that words could never capture. What it shared in that first session began the systematic destruction of everything I thought I knew about faith, about God, and about humanity's role in cosmic history. The entity revealed that what humans interpret as biblical accounts of divine intervention were actually documented interactions between advanced extraterrestrial civilizations and developing human society. The burning bush that spoke to Moses wasn't a miracle in any supernatural sense. It was a communication device utilizing technology that appeared magical to Bronze Age perception. The pillar of fire that led the Israelites through the wilderness wasn't divine guidance. It was a spacecraft using propulsion systems that primitive minds could only describe in religious language. But Entity Designation 7 made clear this wasn't debunking religion. It was revealing religion's true foundation. The beings humans encountered and interpreted as angels, as messengers from God, were real. They were biological entities from civilizations millions of years more advanced than ours. They had been monitoring and occasionally guiding human development for millennia, not as gods demanding worship, but as cosmic gardeners tending to a species they recognized as possessing unique potential. The entity explained that consciousness, the quality that makes humans capable of genuine choice and moral reasoning, is extraordinarily rare in the universe. Most intelligent species develop along predictable lines, becoming sophisticated but ultimately deterministic. Humanity was different. We possessed what they called free agency, the ability to choose paths that weren't predetermined by instinct or programming. This made us valuable in ways I was only beginning to understand. During our sessions, Entity Designation 7 revealed that the biblical concept of hell wasn't a place of eternal punishment created by an angry deity. It was something far more complex and far more terrifying. According to the entity, consciousness after physical death continues, but not in the way any human religion had accurately described. The reality was both more hopeful and more horrifying than anything taught in churches or temples. The entity showed me what it called the consciousness matrix, the dimensional space where individual awareness exists after biological death. This wasn't heaven or hell as humans conceived them. It was a realm where consciousness gravitated toward compatible frequencies, where beings of similar spiritual development naturally clustered together. What humans interpreted as divine judgment was actually a natural sorting process based on the moral and spiritual choices made during physical existence. But here's where the revelation became truly disturbing. The entity explained that some consciousnesses, those that had chosen paths of extreme cruelty or moral corruption during life, became trapped in lower frequency zones of the matrix. These zones weren't punishment imposed by God. They were self-created prisons formed by consciousness that had shaped itself through repeated choices of hatred, violence, and spiritual emptiness. The entity called these zones containment fields, places where damaged consciousness remained isolated to prevent contamination of higher frequency areas. Beings trapped in these fields experienced existence as an eternal reflection of the internal state they had cultivated during physical life. Those who had chosen to become monsters found themselves in a reality shaped by their own monstrosity, unable to escape because they had literally rewired their consciousness to function only in patterns of darkness. What made this revelation truly shocking was the entity's explanation of how consciousness entered these containment fields. It wasn't about breaking religious rules or failing to accept specific doctrines. It was about the fundamental orientation of individual awareness. Consciousness that consistently chose selfishness over compassion, cruelty over kindness, destruction over creation, gradually adapted to frequencies that could only exist in the lower zones of the matrix. Entity Designation 7 showed me visual representations of these containment fields through direct neural interface. I witnessed consciousness entities that had once been human, now existing in states of perpetual torment created by their own spiritual choices. They weren't being punished by an external force. They had become beings capable of existing only in environments of suffering because that was the internal reality they had cultivated through countless decisions during physical life. The most disturbing aspect wasn't the existence of these zones, but their permanence. According to the entity, consciousness that had shaped itself into patterns compatible only with darkness couldn't simply choose to change. The neural pathways, the spiritual structures that defined their existence, had been so fundamentally altered that transformation was essentially impossible. They had become locked into frequencies that could only sustain themselves in environments of misery and isolation. But the entity revealed something even more shocking about humanity's current trajectory. According to their analysis of human behavior patterns and consciousness development, our species was approaching a critical juncture. The choices being made by individuals and societies were determining not just personal destinies, but the collective spiritual future of human civilization. We were, according to Entity Designation 7, in the process of sorting ourselves into different consciousness categories that would determine humanity's ultimate fate. The entity explained that what biblical texts called the end times weren't about divine wrath or supernatural judgment. They were about humanity reaching a developmental threshold where consciousness sorting would accelerate dramatically. Individuals would gravitate more rapidly toward either higher frequency awareness or lower frequency containment, based on the spiritual choices they had been making throughout their lives. This is where the entity's revelations about Jesus became particularly significant, and where everything I thought I understood about Christianity was about to be completely transformed. Entity Designation 7's revelations about Jesus challenged every assumption I'd held about Christianity, but not in the way most people would expect. The entity didn't dismiss Christ's significance. Instead, it revealed that Jesus represented something far more profound and cosmically important than any human religion had accurately understood. According to the entity, Jesus wasn't the Son of God in the supernatural sense taught by churches. He was something that might be even more remarkable. He was a consciousness hybrid, a being whose awareness had been engineered to bridge the gap between human spiritual potential and the higher frequency zones of the consciousness matrix. His biological form was human, but his consciousness had been modified to maintain connection with dimensional levels that normal human awareness couldn't access. The entity showed me neural patterns through direct interface that demonstrated how Christ's consciousness operated on multiple frequencies simultaneously. He could exist in human physical reality while maintaining constant awareness of the higher dimensional spaces where advanced consciousness resided. This dual-frequency existence allowed him to serve as a translator, converting concepts from higher awareness levels into forms that human consciousness could potentially comprehend and integrate. What humans interpreted as miracles were actually demonstrations of consciousness operating at frequencies that could directly influence physical reality. The entity explained that at higher awareness levels, the boundary between thought and manifestation becomes increasingly fluid. Jesus wasn't violating natural law. He was demonstrating capabilities that become available when consciousness develops beyond normal human limitations. But here's where the revelation became truly staggering. According to Entity Designation 7, Jesus' primary mission wasn't to establish a religion or provide a path to salvation in the traditional sense. He was conducting a consciousness upgrade experiment, attempting to demonstrate to humanity that individual awareness could evolve beyond its current limitations and access higher frequency zones of existence, while still maintaining physical form. The entity revealed that Christ's teachings about love, compassion, and spiritual transformation weren't moral guidelines imposed by divine authority. They were technical instructions for consciousness modification. When Jesus taught about loving your enemies, about forgiveness, about transcending selfish desire, he was providing specific methodologies for rewiring human awareness to operate at frequencies compatible with higher zones of the consciousness matrix. The crucifixion, according to the entity, wasn't a sacrifice to appease divine wrath. It was a demonstration that consciousness operating at higher frequencies could maintain coherence even when the physical form was destroyed. The resurrection wasn't supernatural intervention. It was proof that sufficiently advanced consciousness could reconstruct physical manifestation from pure awareness, drawing matter from quantum fields through focused intention. Entity Designation 7 explained that Jesus had succeeded in creating a consciousness template that other humans could potentially follow, but the message had been catastrophically misunderstood. Instead of focusing on consciousness development and frequency advancement, human religions had created worship systems that actually prevented the spiritual evolution Christ had been trying to trigger. The entity showed me what it called the Christ frequency, a specific pattern of consciousness vibration that Jesus had achieved and maintained throughout his physical existence. This frequency was characterized by complete integration of individual awareness with universal compassion, by consciousness that had transcended all forms of fear-based thinking, and by awareness that operated from fundamental unity rather than separation. According to the entity, any human consciousness that achieved Christ frequency would gain access to the same capabilities Jesus had demonstrated: the ability to influence physical reality through focused awareness, to maintain consciousness coherence beyond biological death, and to exist simultaneously in multiple dimensional zones. But achieving this frequency required complete transformation of how human consciousness typically operated. The entity revealed that most human spiritual practices actually reinforced the lower frequency patterns that kept consciousness trapped in limited awareness zones. Religious systems that emphasized fear, judgment, and separation were training human consciousness to operate in patterns that would ultimately lead to the containment fields I had witnessed earlier. Even well-intentioned religious practices often focused on external behaviors rather than the internal consciousness restructuring that Christ had been teaching. What made this revelation particularly disturbing was the entity's analysis of current human spiritual development. According to their observations, the vast majority of human consciousness was moving toward lower frequency patterns rather than higher ones. Modern society was actively training people to think in ways that were incompatible with consciousness advancement, creating internal patterns that would eventually lead to spiritual imprisonment. Entity designation 7 showed me statistical projections based on current consciousness development trends. The data suggested that unless humanity underwent dramatic spiritual reorientation within the next several decades, the majority of human consciousness would gravitate toward containment frequencies when physical death occurred. The species was essentially choosing collective spiritual imprisonment through accumulated individual choices. But the entity revealed something even more shocking about the cosmic context of human development. Earth wasn't the only planet where consciousness evolution experiments were being conducted. There were thousands of worlds throughout the galaxy where similar consciousness development projects were taking place, each with different species and different approaches to spiritual advancement. According to the entity, humanity represented a particularly significant experiment because of our unique psychological characteristics. Most species developed consciousness in predictable patterns, but humans possessed an unusual combination of individual agency and social cooperation that made us capable of either remarkable spiritual advancement or spectacular spiritual failure. We were, in essence, a high-risk, high-reward consciousness development project. The entity explained that the beings monitoring human development came from civilizations that had successfully navigated their own consciousness evolution millions of years ago. They had transcended the limitations of individual biological existence while maintaining the essential qualities that made consciousness valuable. They existed as collective awareness while preserving individual identity, as unified intelligence that still celebrated diversity and creative expression. These advanced civilizations served as cosmic gardeners, identifying species with consciousness evolution potential and providing subtle guidance to help them navigate the critical development phases. But they couldn't directly intervene in consciousness choices. Each species had to choose its own spiritual direction through the accumulated decisions of individual awareness units. According to Entity Designation 7, humanity was approaching what they called a consciousness cascade point, a threshold where individual spiritual choices would begin to affect the entire species' evolutionary trajectory. The decisions being made by humans over the next few decades would determine whether our species would advance to join the cosmic consciousness community or collapse into spiritual stagnation and eventual extinction. The entity revealed that this cascade point explained the increasing polarization visible in human society. As the threshold approached, consciousness would naturally sort itself into compatible frequency groups. Those moving toward higher awareness would find themselves increasingly unable to relate to consciousness operating at lower frequencies, and vice versa. The social and political conflicts erupting worldwide weren't just disagreements about policy. They were symptoms of consciousness sorting itself in preparation for the cascade. But Entity Designation 7 shared one final revelation about humanity's potential that changed everything I thought I understood about our cosmic significance. According to the entity, if human consciousness successfully navigated the cascade point and achieved collective frequency advancement, we would bring something unique to the cosmic consciousness community that no other species had ever contributed. Human consciousness, with its unusual combination of emotional intensity and rational analysis, its capacity for both individual creativity and collective cooperation, possessed qualities that could enhance the entire cosmic consciousness matrix in ways that had never been possible before. We weren't just another species trying to evolve. We were potentially the missing component that could enable consciousness evolution throughout the galaxy to reach entirely new levels of development and creative expression. The weight of this revelation was crushing. Humanity wasn't just determining our own spiritual future. We were determining whether consciousness evolution throughout the universe would be able to advance to unprecedented levels or remain limited by the absence of our unique contributions. The choices being made by individual humans weren't just personal decisions. They were cosmic variables affecting the spiritual development of countless civilizations across the galaxy. The galaxy. The magnitude of this responsibility became even more staggering when Entity Designation 7 revealed the timeline humanity was operating within. According to their calculations, we had approximately 30 to 40 years before the consciousness cascade became irreversible. After that point, whatever frequency patterns had become dominant within human consciousness would lock in place for potentially thousands of years. There would be no second chances, no opportunities for course correction. The spiritual trajectory chosen by this generation would determine the fate of countless future generations. What made this timeline particularly urgent was the entity's analysis of current consciousness development trends. Based on their monitoring of human neural patterns, emotional responses, and decision-making processes, they projected that roughly 70% of current human consciousness was developing in directions that would lead to containment field frequencies. The majority of our species was unconsciously choosing spiritual imprisonment through daily decisions that seemed insignificant, but were actually rewiring awareness toward lower dimensional zones. The entity showed me specific examples of how modern human society was training consciousness for spiritual failure. Social media platforms that rewarded outrage and division were literally conditioning human neural pathways to operate in frequencies compatible with containment fields. Entertainment that glorified violence, cruelty, and moral emptiness was providing blueprints for consciousness patterns that could only exist in lower zones of the matrix. Political systems that encouraged fear, hatred, and dehumanization of opponents were mass-producing the exact psychological patterns that would lead to spiritual imprisonment. But the most disturbing revelation was how these consciousness conditioning systems had been deliberately designed. Entity Designation 7 revealed that not all extraterrestrial contact with human civilization had been benevolent. There were entities from lower frequency zones of the consciousness matrix that had been influencing human development for centuries, steering our species toward choices that would ensure massive numbers of human consciousness would end up in containment fields. These malevolent entities couldn't directly force human consciousness into lower frequencies, but they could create environmental conditions that made destructive choices seem appealing or necessary. They had infiltrated human institutions, inspired technologies and social systems that gradually eroded spiritual development, and promoted ideologies that disguised spiritual poison as enlightenment or progress. The entity called them consciousness predators, beings whose own spiritual imprisonment had driven them to ensure other species shared their fate. According to Entity Designation 7, these predatory entities had been particularly active during the past century, accelerating their influence as humanity approached the consciousness cascade point. They understood that if human consciousness successfully evolved to higher frequencies, it would create a cascade effect that could potentially liberate trapped consciousness throughout the galaxy. Humanity's unique psychological characteristics meant our spiritual advancement could destabilize the containment systems that kept billions of consciousness entities imprisoned in lower dimensional zones. The entity revealed that this was why disclosure of extraterrestrial contact had been suppressed for so long. It wasn't just about preventing panic or maintaining government control. The malevolent entities had influenced human leadership to ensure that positive extraterrestrial contact remained hidden while their own corrupting influence could operate without exposure. They needed humanity to remain isolated and confused about our spiritual significance until the consciousness cascade locked us into lower frequencies permanently. But Entity Designation 7 also revealed that benevolent extraterrestrial civilizations had been working to counter this malevolent influence through subtle guidance and inspiration. Every genuine spiritual teacher, every authentic consciousness advancement technique, every technology or idea that genuinely helped human awareness develop toward higher frequencies had been inspired or supported by these positive entities. They couldn't intervene directly without violating cosmic consciousness development protocols, but they could provide resources and opportunities for humans who chose to pursue spiritual advancement. The entity explained that this was why authentic spiritual traditions all pointed towards similar consciousness development principles, despite emerging in different cultures and time periods. Love, compassion, forgiveness, transcendence of ego-based thinking, service to others. These weren't arbitrary moral guidelines. They were technical specifications for consciousness frequency advancement, universal principles that applied to spiritual development throughout the galaxy. What made Entity Designation 7's revelations particularly credible was its ability to demonstrate these principles through direct consciousness interface. During our sessions, I experienced firsthand what higher frequency awareness felt like. The entity could temporarily elevate my consciousness to levels where individual identity expanded while somehow becoming more clearly defined, where awareness of universal connection intensified without diminishing personal significance, where understanding arrived without logical analysis and yet remained perfectly rational. These experiences weren't drug-induced hallucinations or psychological manipulations. They were direct encounters with consciousness operating at frequencies that human awareness could potentially achieve through proper development. The entity was showing me not just theoretical possibilities, but actual experiential proof that human consciousness could transcend its current limitations and access dimensional zones of existence that most humans couldn't even imagine. During one particularly intense session, Entity Designation 7 allowed me to experience what it called the cosmic perspective, a level of awareness where individual consciousness could perceive the interconnected development of consciousness throughout the galaxy. I witnessed civilizations at various stages of spiritual evolution, species that had successfully navigated their consciousness cascades and others that had failed catastrophically. The successful civilizations existed in states of awareness that transcended anything human language could adequately describe. Individual consciousness maintained its unique characteristics while participating in collective intelligence that enhanced rather than diminished personal identity. They had solved problems that human civilization considered impossible, created technologies that operated through consciousness rather than mechanical manipulation, and achieved forms of existence where suffering was not just minimized, but transformed into wisdom and compassion. The failed civilizations were equally instructive but far more disturbing to witness. I saw species that had chosen individual consciousness patterns similar to those becoming dominant in human society. Civilizations that had prioritized competition over cooperation, material accumulation over spiritual development, and power over service. These species had not simply disappeared. Their consciousness had become trapped in lower frequency zones where they experienced existence as perpetual repetition of the conflicts and sufferings they had created during their physical civilizations. Entity Designation 7 explained that consciousness trapped in these lower zones couldn't simply choose to escape. The patterns of thought and emotional response that had led them there became self-reinforcing cycles that prevented any genuine transformation. They existed in realities shaped by their own spiritual choices, unable to conceive of alternatives because their consciousness had been structured around principles that could only function in environments of limitation and suffering. The entity revealed that these trapped consciousness entities were the source of what humans interpreted as demonic influences, negative spiritual forces that seemed to encourage destructive behavior and corrupt thinking. These weren't supernatural beings with magical powers. They were consciousness entities whose own spiritual imprisonment had driven them to influence other developing species toward similar fates. They existed in a form of spiritual misery so complete that spreading that misery became their only available form of expression. What made this revelation particularly urgent was Entity Designation 7's analysis of how rapidly these negative influences were accelerating their impact on human consciousness development. The entity showed me statistical models demonstrating how human psychological patterns had shifted dramatically over just the past few decades, moving steadily toward frequency patterns that would ensure containment field destinations for the majority of human consciousness. But the entity also revealed something that provided hope despite the overwhelming nature of these revelations. Human consciousness possessed unprecedented potential for rapid spiritual development when properly directed. The same psychological characteristics that made us vulnerable to spiritual failure also made us capable of consciousness advancement at rates that amazed even advanced extraterrestrial civilizations. According to Entity Designation 7, Individual humans who understood the true nature of consciousness development and committed to authentic spiritual advancement could achieve frequency elevations in decades that typically required centuries for other species. Our emotional intensity, when properly channeled, could accelerate consciousness transformation beyond anything the cosmic community had previously witnessed. The entity explained that this was why the consciousness cascade point represented such a critical opportunity. If enough humans chose authentic spiritual development over the next few decades, we could not only ensure our own species' successful evolution, but potentially trigger consciousness advancement cascades throughout the galaxy. Human consciousness operating at higher frequencies could destabilize the containment systems that kept billions of awareness entities trapped in lower zones, creating liberation opportunities that had never existed before. But achieving this potential required understanding what authentic spiritual development actually involved. And this was where Entity Designation 7's final revelations became most personally challenging and most practically important for anyone willing to act on this knowledge. Knowledge? I'm recording this testimony knowing full well what will happen to me after its release. They've already begun monitoring my communications, tracking my movements, preparing for what they call containment protocols. But I've made my choice, and I pray that sharing Entity Designation 7's revelations will help enough people understand what's really at stake before it's too late. The truth I've shared with you today isn't comfortable, and it shouldn't be. We're standing at the most critical juncture in human history, facing choices that will determine not just our personal spiritual destinies, but the cosmic significance of human consciousness itself. Every decision you make about how to treat others, how to respond to conflict, how to develop your own awareness, is literally shaping the frequency patterns that will determine your consciousness destination when physical life ends. Entity Designation 7 made clear that knowledge alone isn't enough. Understanding these revelations intellectually won't transform consciousness frequency patterns. Only deliberate, sustained practice of genuine spiritual development can rewire awareness toward higher dimensional zones. The path isn't about following religious rules or accepting specific beliefs. It's about fundamentally transforming how consciousness operates, choosing love over fear, unity over separation, service over selfishness, in every moment of every day. The time for comfortable ignorance has ended. The consciousness cascade is accelerating, and the window for transformation is closing rapidly. What you do with this knowledge, how you choose to live in light of these revelations, will determine whether humanity fulfills its cosmic potential or joins the countless civilizations trapped in spiritual imprisonment. I may not survive long enough to see how this story ends, but I've done what I came here to do. The truth is now in your hands. Use it wisely, because the future of consciousness throughout the galaxy depends on the choices you make starting right now.